Hey everyone, today we're tackling a story that sounds like historical fiction, but is actually just history refusing to behave. Catherine the Great, the German princess who became Russia's longest ruling female leader, overthrew her own husband in a coup, and built her power base partly through a revolving door of male favorites who doubled as political allies, military commanders, and yes, lovers. Forget the sanitized textbook version where she's just a patron of the arts who wrote letters to Voltaire. The truth is messier, smarter, and way more revealing about how power actually worked in 18th century Europe. Picture this. You're a teenage girl from a minor German principality, not even particularly wealthy or important, and you get shipped off to Russia to marry the heir to the throne. You don't speak Russian. You're not Russian Orthodox. Your future husband is, to put it charitably, not thrilled about the arrangement and spends most of his time playing with toy soldiers. Your mother-in-law, the reigning Empress, watches your every move like a hawk because your only job is to produce an heir. And if you fail, back to Germany in disgrace if you're lucky. Most women in that position would have kept their heads down, learned to embroider, maybe started a nice collection of lapdogs. Catherine looked at that situation and decided to stage one of the most successful political coups in European history. And here's the part that makes moralists uncomfortable. Her romantic relationships weren't a distraction from her political ambitions, they were integral to them. Now, before we go further, let me be clear about what this video is and isn't. We're not here to clutch pearls about 18th century sexual politics or pretend that Catherine's personal life is more interesting than her 34-year reign that expanded Russia's borders, reformed its legal system, and turned it into a major European power. But we're also not going to pretend that her relationships with men like Grigory Orlov, Grigory Potemkin, and a string of younger favorites didn't matter. They mattered enormously, because Catherine understood something that a lot of rulers, then and now, don't quite grasp. Political power and personal loyalty are deeply entangled. And if you're a woman in a system designed to exclude you from power, you use every tool available. Including seduction, yes, but more importantly, the strategic deployment of patronage, military support, and factional alliance building that happen to be wrapped up in romantic relationships. If you like history that refuses to sugarcoat empire or pretend that powerful women had to be saints to be effective, go ahead and hit subscribe, we're just getting started. So let's start with who Catherine actually was before she became Catherine the Great. She was born Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729 in Stettin, Prussia, modern-day Poland. Her father was a minor German prince, the kind of guy with an impressive title and a drafty castle, but not much actual money or influence. Sophie was smart, ambitious, and plagued by the kind of education that aristocratic girls got. Languages, dancing, enough history and philosophy to be charming at dinner parties, but nothing that would threaten male authority. Except Sophie took it seriously. She read everything she could get her hands on. She learned French fluently, the language of Enlightenment intellectuals and European diplomacy. And when the summons came in 1744 that she'd been selected as a bride for the Russian Grand Duke Peter, she didn't see it as a romantic adventure. She saw it as the opportunity of a lifetime. The selection process itself tells you everything about how royal marriages worked. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, Peter's aunt, who'd seized the throne herself in a coup, because coups were basically the Russian royal family hobby, needed her nephew to marry and produce heirs. She wanted a bride who was pretty enough, noble enough, but not too powerful or politically connected, someone biddable, someone who wouldn't threaten Elizabeth's own position or bring dangerous foreign alliances. Sophie's mother had connections to the Russian court and pushed hard for the match. Sophie herself. She later wrote that she barely remembered what Peter looked like when she agreed to marry him. She was 14 years old and understood that this was her shot at something bigger than being a minor princess in a backwater German court. She arrived in Russia in 1744 and immediately got to work. First move, convert to Russian Orthodoxy. She took the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. She threw herself into learning Russian, staying up late with tutors, even when she was sick, because she understood that language is power. and that the Russian court would never fully accept a German interloper who couldn't speak to them. Her future husband Peter, by contrast, made no such effort. He was ethnically German, born in Kiel, and he never really adapted to Russia. He spoke Russian poorly, preferred German, and made no secret of his contempt for Russian customs and orthodoxy. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's enemy, and spent his time drilling toy soldiers and playing military dress-up. The Russian nobility noticed, Elizabeth noticed, and Catherine noticed that they noticed. The wedding happened in 1745. Catherine was 16, Peter was 17. By all accounts, it was a disaster from the start. The marriage wasn't consummated for years. Sources disagree on exactly how long, but the consensus is that Peter was either physically unable, psychologically unwilling, or just more interested in his mistresses and his toy regiments. Catherine, meanwhile, had a job to do: produce an heir. The pressure was immense. Elizabeth watched her constantly, interrogated her about her cycles, humiliated her about the lack of a pregnancy. Catherine later wrote that she spent years in a state of anxiety so severe she developed physical symptoms. And here's where the historical record gets complicated, because this is the 18th century, and nobody kept detailed medical records about royal dysfunction. But what we know is this. In 1754, 9 years into the marriage, Catherine finally gave birth to a son, the future Paul I. Elizabeth immediately took the baby away to raise him herself. Catherine barely saw her own child. And here's the question everyone asks, and that historians argue about. Who was Paul's father? Peter, or Sergei Saltykov, the handsome young courtier who'd become Catherine's close companion and, according to her own memoirs, her first real love affair? Catherine never directly confirmed it in writing, she was way too smart for that, but she heavily implied it. And here's what matters more than the paternity question. Catherine had learned that the rules didn't apply the way she'd been taught. She was stuck in a marriage to a man who didn't want her, under surveillance by an empress who saw her as a broodmare, in a country where she'd always be a foreigner. The system was rigged. So she started rigging it back. Let's talk about Peter, because you can't understand the coup without understanding just how catastrophically bad he was at the job of being a Russian Grand Duke. This wasn't just a personality clash or a bad marriage, though it was definitely both of those things. Peter was politically toxic. He alienated the Russian military by making them adopt Prussian-style uniforms and drill routines, because he thought Frederick the Great was the coolest guy in Europe and wanted to play Prussian army with real soldiers. He alienated the Orthodox Church by openly mocking Russian religious practices and talking about how much better Lutheranism was. He alienated the nobility by being erratic, petty and prone to public humiliation of people he didn't like. And he alienated his wife by flaunting his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova, and allegedly threatening to divorce Catherine and marry Elizabeth instead, which would have sent Catherine back to Germany in disgrace and possibly gotten her locked up in a convent for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Catherine was doing the opposite. She was learning Russian politics from the inside. She read voraciously, history, philosophy, political theory, everything from Montesquieu to Voltaire. She cultivated relationships with key figures in the Russian court and military. She presented herself as more Russian than the Russians, pious, respectful of Orthodox tradition, genuinely interested in Russian culture and governance. She played the long game. And she also, and this is where it gets interesting, she started building a network of male allies who were personally loyal to her, not to Peter or Elizabeth. Men like Grigory Orlov. Grigory Orlov was an artillery officer, one of 5 brothers who all served in the military and who collectively had serious influence among the Guards regiments, the elite military units stationed in St. Petersburg, who had a long history of making and breaking Russian emperors. He was tall, handsome, brave in combat, and according to contemporary accounts, absolutely devoted to Catherine. Their affair started around 1759 or 1760. By 1762, Catherine was pregnant with his child, a son, Alexei, born secretly and raised quietly because an illegitimate child would have been a massive scandal. But Orlov wasn't just a lover. He was a political organizer. He and his brothers had connections throughout the military, And as Peter became more erratic and more dangerous to Catherine, Orlov became the nucleus of a conspiracy. Empress Elizabeth died in January of 1762, and Peter became Emperor Peter III. It lasted 6 months. 6 months of Peter undoing Russian foreign policy gains by making peace with Prussia, just when Russia was winning the 7 Years' War, basically giving away everything Russia had fought for because he personally admired Frederick the Great. 6 months of insulting the Orthodox Church, alienating the Guards and publicly humiliating Catherine. He allegedly planned to arrest her, divorce her, and marry his mistress. Catherine's allies told her it was now or never. The military was ready to move. The nobility was ready to support her. The church was ready to bless it. All she had to do was give the word. On the morning of June 28, 1762, Catherine was at Peterhof, the imperial summer palace outside St. Petersburg. Peter was at another palace, Oranienbaum, with his mistress and a small entourage. Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, rode through the night to Peterhof and woke Catherine up before dawn. The plot was moving. She had to come to St. Petersburg immediately. She got dressed, got in a carriage, and rode into the city with Orlov. When she arrived, the Guards' regiments were waiting. They'd already been rallied by the Orlov brothers and other conspirators. Catherine appeared before them, and they proclaimed her Empress, not regent for her son Paul, but Empress in her own right. The troops swore loyalty to her. The church hierarchy blessed her. Key nobles lined up behind her. Within hours, Peter's support had evaporated. Peter, to his credit, realized immediately that he was finished. He tried to negotiate, then tried to flee, then tried to rally troops, but nobody came. Within 2 days, he'd abdicated. Catherine had won without a single shot being fired in anger. She issued a manifesto justifying the coup. Peter had threatened the Orthodox Church, betrayed Russian interests, and planned to harm her. The manifesto was brilliant propaganda. It positioned Catherine as the defender of Russia against a foreign Lutheran pro-Prussian usurper, even though Catherine herself was just as German as Peter. But she'd done the work. She'd learned the language, converted to orthodoxy, built the alliances, played the role. Peter hadn't, and now he was a prisoner. What happened next is one of those historical moments where the official story and the likely truth are miles apart. Peter was taken to a country estate called Ropsha and held under guard. On July 17, 1762, less than 3 weeks after the coup, he was dead. The official story, he died of hemorrhoidal colic, basically a digestive illness. The actual story, according to a letter that Alexei Orlov sent to Catherine, and that historians widely believe is authentic, Peter got into a drunken altercation with his guards, and they killed him. Orlov's letter reportedly said something like, "We can't remember how it happened, but he's dead." Catherine never punished anyone. She also never publicly acknowledged foul play. She held a state funeral, played the grieving widow, and moved on. Now, did Catherine order Peter's death? Historians argue about it. There's no smoking gun document that says Catherine commands the death of Peter. But here's what we know. She was smart enough to understand that a deposed emperor, especially one with a legitimate claim and foreign supporters, was a massive liability. As long as Peter was alive, he was a rallying point for counter-coups. His death was extremely convenient for her, whether she explicitly ordered it, tacitly approved it, or just created the conditions where her allies understood what needed to happen and took care of it. That's the question. And honestly, in the context of 18th century power politics, the distinction might not matter as much as we'd like to think. Dead husbands don't launch counter-coups. Tell me in the comments, if you're Catherine in that moment, do you give the explicit order, or do you just make sure the people around you understand what success looks like and let them handle the details? So now Catherine is Empress of Russia, and she's got a problem. She's a usurper. Technically, her son Paul is the legitimate heir, and she's ruling in her own name, not as regent. She's a woman in a system that doesn't really have a template for female autocrats outside of Elizabeth, who at least had Romanov blood. Catherine is a German foreigner who seized power through a military coup. She needs legitimacy, she needs loyalty, and she needs results. And here's where the army of lovers part of the story really kicks in. Because Catherine understood that in a court system, personal loyalty is political currency, and romantic relationships were one of the ways she built and maintained that loyalty. Grigory Orlov was her partner in the immediate aftermath of the coup. He was rewarded lavishly, titles, estates, money, influence. He was her public favorite, and everyone knew it. But he wasn't just a decorative boyfriend. He had real power. He commanded loyalty among the Guards regiments. He was involved in military planning. Catherine used him as a political enforcer and as a visible symbol of her connection to the military. But here's the thing about favorites. They're useful until they're not. By the late 1760s, Orlov was getting arrogant, demanding more power, pushing back against Catherine's decisions. And Catherine had met someone else, Grigory Potemkin. Potemkin was a different animal entirely. He was brilliant, ambitious, moody, unpredictable, and arguably the love of Catherine's life. He was an officer in the Horse Guards, and he'd distinguished himself during the coup. There's a famous story that he lost an eye in a brawl, though the details are disputed. He caught Catherine's attention not just because he was charming, but because he was genuinely intelligent and politically capable. Their relationship started around 1774, and it was intense. Catherine's letters to Potemkin, hundreds of them survived, are affectionate, passionate, playful, and also deeply political. She called him pet names, discussed policy, asked his advice, teased him, and relied on him in ways she didn't rely on anyone else. Here's where it gets complicated. Some historians believe Catherine and Potemkin secretly married. There's no definitive proof, but there are hints in letters and court gossip. What's certain is that their relationship was different from her other affairs. Potemkin had real power. He became Catherine's co-ruler in many ways, especially in military and foreign policy. He led the annexation of Crimea in 1783, a massive expansion of Russian territory that gave Russia access to the Black Sea and positioned it as a major power in Eastern Europe. He built cities, founded the Black Sea Fleet, governed vast territories, and became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Russia. And even after their romantic relationship evolved into something more like a deep partnership and friendship, he remained Catherine's most trusted advisor. He even helped her select her later favorites. Because here's the part that makes this story so fascinating and so uncomfortable for people who want history to fit into neat moral categories. After Potemkin, Catherine had a series of younger male favorites, a lot of them. The list includes names like Pyotr Zavadovsky, Simon Zorich, Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, Alexander Lanskoy, Alexander Yermolov, and Platon Zubov, among others. These relationships followed a pattern. A young man, usually an officer, would be introduced at court, catch Catherine's attention, become her favorite, receive lavish gifts and titles, and wield significant influence for a period of time, anywhere from a few months to several years. Then the relationship would end, usually cordially, and the former favorite would retire to a comfortable estate with his wealth and titles intact. Then a new favorite would arrive. Critics at the time, especially foreign diplomats and satirists, had a field day with this. They called Catherine a nymphomaniac, accused her of degeneracy, invented grotesque sexual rumors that have persisted for centuries despite being historically baseless. The famous horse myth, the idea that Catherine died having sex with a horse, is completely fabricated. It originated from French anti-Russian propaganda and has zero basis in fact. Catherine died of a stroke at age 67 in her bed, surrounded by attendants. But the myth persists because it's salacious and because people have always been uncomfortable with the idea of a powerful woman who was open about her sexuality and her romantic relationships. But here's what actually happened. Catherine built a system of patronage and loyalty that used romantic relationships as one component, not the only component, but an important one, of how she maintained power. Her favorites weren't just arm candy. Potemkin was a military genius and empire builder. Zavadovsky worked on administrative reform. Lanskoy, who Catherine seemed genuinely to love, was being groomed for serious political responsibilities before he died young of illness. Catherine was reportedly devastated. Zubov, her last favorite, was deeply involved in foreign policy and military campaigns. These men had actual jobs, actual responsibilities, actual power. The romance was part of the package, yes, but the package was fundamentally political. And here's the subversive part. Male rulers had been doing this forever. Louis XV of France had official mistresses like Madame de Pompadour, who wielded enormous political influence. English kings had favorites and mistresses scattered throughout the court. Augustus the Strong of Poland allegedly fathered hundreds of children with various mistresses, and nobody called him a degenerate. They called him Augustus the Strong and celebrated his virility. But when Catherine did the same thing, suddenly it was scandalous. The double standard is so glaring it's almost funny. Almost. Let's zoom out and talk about what Catherine actually accomplished as ruler, because if you focus only on the romantic intrigue, you miss the fact that she was one of the most effective autocrats in Russian history. She reigned for 34 years, from 1762 to 1796. She expanded Russia's territory by about 200,000 square miles, roughly the size of France. She annexed Crimea, partitioned Poland with Prussia and Austria, defeated the Ottoman Empire in multiple wars, and turned Russia into a dominant power in Eastern Europe. She founded new cities, including Odessa and Sevastopol. She commissioned legal reforms, attempted to modernize and rationalize Russian law based on Enlightenment principles, and corresponded with Voltaire, Diderot, and other leading intellectuals. She was also an autocrat who crushed dissent, put down popular uprisings like the Pugachev Rebellion with extreme violence, and presided over a system of serfdom that kept millions of peasants in conditions close to slavery. She talked a good game about Enlightenment ideals, but never seriously threatened the aristocratic power structure that kept her on the throne. Her legal reforms stalled when they ran up against the interests of the nobility. She was progressive by the standards of 18th-century monarchs, which is a low bar, and reactionary by the standards of actual Enlightenment philosophy. She was a contradiction, like most rulers, capable of genuine intellectual engagement and also brutal political repression. But here's what she understood better than most. Power is performance. Being a legitimate ruler isn't just about legal claims or bloodlines. It's about convincing people that you deserve to rule. Catherine spent her entire reign performing legitimacy. She performed piety and devotion to orthodoxy, even though she'd been raised Lutheran. She performed Russian patriotism, even though she was German. She performed maternal concern for her people, even though her relationship with her actual son Paul was distant and strained. She performed Enlightenment ideals in her letters to intellectuals, even though her actual governance was often pragmatic and ruthless. And yes, she performed femininity and sexuality in ways that were legible to her court. She was a woman, she had lovers, but she was also unmistakably the boss. Her favorites were part of that performance. They signaled vitality, desirability, continued relevance. They also gave her a network of personally loyal men in key military and administrative positions, and they allowed her to manage the problem of intimacy and trust in a system where everyone was constantly jockeying for power and where betrayal was always a possibility. If you're Catherine, who do you trust? Your son who resents you for taking the throne that should have been his, the nobility, who tolerate you because you're useful but would drop you in a second if someone better came along, foreign allies who have their own agendas, or the man in your bed who owes his entire position to your favor and who knows that his wealth and power evaporate the moment you get bored. Here's the thing about the army of lovers framing that's both true and misleading. It's true in the sense that Catherine's romantic relationships were tied to her political survival and success. Orlov and his brothers gave her the military muscle to seize power. Potemkin gave her the strategic vision and administrative capability to expand and consolidate her empire. Her later favorites gave her continued connection to younger generations of officers and aristocrats, and signaled that she was still vital and relevant, even as she aged. The relationships were functional, not just decorative, but it's misleading if it makes you think this was primarily a story about sex. It wasn't. It was a story about power and how women access it in systems designed to exclude them. Catherine couldn't rely on traditional forms of male authority. She wasn't a conquering general. She wasn't a dynastic heir with unquestionable bloodlines. She wasn't a religious figure. She was a foreign woman who'd seized power in a coup, so she built authority through other means: intelligence, strategy, patronage networks, propaganda, administrative competence, military success, and yes, romantic relationships that doubled as political alliances. The men she elevated weren't interchangeable. They had different skills, different personalities, different roles. Orlov was the muscle. Potemkin was the visionary partner. Lanskoy was possibly the genuine romantic love cut short by death. Zubov was the ruthless final favorite who helped manage an aging empress's court and military campaigns. Each served a purpose, each was chosen carefully, and each was dismissed or transitioned out when the relationship stopped serving Catherine's interests. That's not romance, that's statecraft. And here's the part that makes some historians uncomfortable. Catherine was good at this. She was better at managing favorites and patronage networks than most male rulers of her era. She kept them loyal, kept them effective, and kept them from turning into threats. She avoided the trap that ensnared rulers like Louis XV, whose mistresses became so powerful they effectively ran policy and generated massive resentment. Catherine's favorites were powerful, but never more powerful than her. She was always the one in control. Let's talk about the end, because Catherine's final years and death tell us something important about how this system worked and what its limits were. By the 1790s, Catherine was in her 60s, dealing with declining health and increasingly reliant on her last favorite, Platon Zubov. Zubov was in his 20s when he became her favorite, 40 years younger than Catherine. He was ambitious, capable, and also ruthless. He was involved in military campaigns against Persia, diplomatic negotiations, and court politics. He was also reportedly unpopular with a lot of the older court nobility, who resented his rapid rise and his youth. Catherine's relationship with her son Paul had never recovered from the fundamental tension at the heart of her reign. She'd taken the throne that should have been his. Paul was the legitimate Romanov heir, the son of Peter III, and Catherine had ruled in her own name for over 30 years, sidelining him completely. As Catherine aged, the question of succession became more urgent. Paul had his own court, his own supporters, and his own vision for Russia that was very different from his mother's. He was reactionary, militaristic, suspicious of Enlightenment ideas, and openly resentful of Catherine's favorites and policies. When Catherine died in November of 1796, Paul became emperor immediately. One of his first acts was to reverse many of Catherine's policies and systematically undermine her legacy. He had Peter III's body exhumed and reburied with full honors, symbolically rehabilitating the husband Catherine had overthrown and possibly had killed. He restricted the power of favorites and tried to formalize succession rules to prevent another Catherine-style usurpation. He treated Platon Zubov with contempt and forced him into retirement. Paul's reign was short and unstable. He was assassinated in a coup in 1801, and his son Alexander became emperor, but his immediate rejection of Catherine's system shows how tenuous her legacy was and how much it had depended on her personal authority. Because here's the hard truth. Catherine's system of favorites and personal loyalty worked brilliantly, as long as Catherine was alive and in power. But it couldn't be institutionalized. It was too dependent on her charisma, her intelligence, her ability to manage complicated men and complicated relationships. When she died, the system died with her. Russian autocracy continued, obviously, but no subsequent Russian ruler replicated Catherine's approach. They couldn't. What Catherine had built was genuinely unique, a hybrid system that combined traditional autocratic power with Enlightenment rhetoric, military expansion with cultural patronage, and political alliance building with romantic relationships. So what's the answer to the question in the title? Did Catherine overthrow her husband with an army of lovers? Yes and no. The coup that deposed Peter III was organized and executed by military officers, most notably the Orlov brothers, who were personally loyal to Catherine. Grigory Orlov was her lover, and that personal relationship was absolutely part of why he and his brothers risked their lives and careers to put her on the throne. So in that sense, yes, romantic loyalty was a factor in the coup's success, but reducing it to just that misses the complexity. The Orlovs weren't motivated solely by romance. They were also ambitious men who saw an opportunity to elevate their family's status and who believed, probably correctly, that Catherine would be a better ruler than Peter. The broader military and nobility supported Catherine because Peter was genuinely unpopular, and because Catherine had spent years cultivating relationships, demonstrating competence, and positioning herself as the better option. The church supported her because she'd embraced orthodoxy and Peter had insulted it. The coup succeeded because Catherine had built a coalition of interests that all benefited from her success. The romance with Orlov was one thread in that tapestry, not the whole thing. And after the coup, Catherine's relationships with favorites like Potemkin and others were embedded in a larger system of governance. They weren't a distraction from her political achievements, they were part of how she achieved them. She used romantic relationships to secure loyalty, reward competence, and maintain a network of trusted allies in a system where trust was rare and betrayal was common. That's not scandalous, it's smart. The scandal, such as it was, came from the fact that Catherine was a woman doing openly what men had done quietly, or not so quietly, for centuries. Male rulers had mistresses, favorites, illegitimate children, romantic entanglements that shaped policy, and nobody called it an army of lovers. They called it court politics. When Catherine did it, it became evidence of her moral degeneracy. The double standard is so absurd, it would be funny if it hadn't been used for 2 centuries to undermine and sexualize one of the most effective rulers in European history. Here's what Catherine understood that a lot of people still don't. Power and intimacy aren't separate spheres, especially not in court systems where proximity to the ruler is the ultimate currency. Being physically close to the king or queen, being in their private chambers, having their ear at moments when decisions get made, that's power. It's always been power. Medieval and early modern courts were structured around this. Who got to dress the king, who sat near them at dinner, who was admitted to private councils, who accompanied them on hunts or military campaigns. These weren't trivial social questions, they were political ones. Access was everything. For male rulers, that access was often managed through male favorites, trusted advisors, childhood friends, military companions, and through mistresses who occupied a semi-official role and wielded significant behind-the-scenes influence. For a female ruler, the dynamics were different, but not entirely dissimilar. Catherine couldn't have a cadre of trusted male friends who just happened to be constantly in her private chambers without it being interpreted sexually. 18th century courts didn't have a template for platonic male-female intimacy at that level of power. So the relationships became romantic, or at least were understood as romantic, because that was the available script, and Catherine used that script brilliantly. Her favorites were intimate companions who also happened to be political and military leaders. The intimacy created loyalty. The political and military competence made them useful. The fact that they were removable, she could dismiss them, transition them out, promote new favorites, gave her flexibility and prevented any one favorite from becoming too powerful or too entrenched. It was a system that balanced intimacy and utility, sentiment and strategy. And it worked for 34 years. Could Catherine have ruled without favorites? Probably. She was smart enough, tough enough, capable enough, but she would have been more isolated, more vulnerable to conspiracy, more dependent on institutional structures that didn't necessarily favor a female foreign usurper. The favorites gave her a layer of personal loyalty that insulated her from some of those dangers. They also gave her companionship and emotional support in a job that was profoundly lonely and a life that was profoundly constrained by protocol and performance. Were they tools? Yes. Were they also genuine relationships with genuine affection and genuine emotion? Also yes. People are complicated. History is complicated. Let's bring this home. Catherine the Great ruled Russia for 34 years, transformed it into a major European power, expanded its territory by hundreds of thousands of square miles, patronized the arts and sciences, corresponded with the leading intellectuals of the Enlightenment, and died in her bed at age 67, having outlasted her enemies, her critics, and her husband's ghost. She did all of this as a foreign-born woman in a system that had no real precedent for female autocratic rule outside of Elizabeth, and she did it by being smarter, tougher, and more adaptable than almost anyone around her. The Army of Lovers framing captures something real about how Catherine built and maintained power. She understood that personal loyalty, romantic relationships, and political alliance building were entangled, and she used that entanglement strategically. She wasn't unique in doing this. She was unique in being a woman doing it openly and successfully. The men she elevated weren't just decoration or indulgence. They were partners, allies, administrators, military leaders, and yes, lovers. The relationship served multiple purposes simultaneously, which is exactly how court politics worked. What makes Catherine's story uncomfortable for some people is that it doesn't fit into neat categories. She wasn't a villain or a saint, a feminist icon or a cautionary tale about female excess. She was a ruler who played the game brilliantly, who understood power in its most naked and practical forms, and who used every tool available to her, including her sexuality, her intelligence, her ruthlessness, and her charm, to build something that lasted. The fact that she was a woman doing this openly and unapologetically is what made it scandalous then, and what makes it fascinating now. So did she overthrow her husband with an army of lovers? She overthrew her husband with military support, political intelligence, religious legitimacy, and strategic alliances, one of which happened to involve being romantically involved with one of the key coup plotters. She maintained power for 3 decades after that, by building a system where loyalty, competence, and intimacy were deliberately intertwined. And she did it all, while the rest of Europe gossiped, invented salacious rumors, and underestimated her, right up until the moment they had to acknowledge that this German princess who seized power in a coup had become one of the most formidable rulers of the 18th century. If you're interested in more stories about rulers who refused to play by the rules and built power in ways that made everyone uncomfortable, subscribe and let me know what historical figure you want to hear about next. I've got a whole list of people who made their contemporaries nervous and their biographers confused. History's a lot messier and more interesting than the textbook version, and Catherine the Great is a perfect example of why the mess matters.